Middle of chapter 3. We're middle of Eis Gimel. It's page Reish Samach Dalet in our copies here. So just to summarize what we've said till now, we brought a mimer from the Alter Rebbe on the famous story of the widow who comes to Elisha and says that her husband has passed away and the creditors are coming to take her children away, her two children. So we explained this story according to Chassidus, a mystical interpretation of the story. There's obviously the actual story as it played out in Tanakh, with a woman who comes to Elisha and he says to fill up empty vessels with a little bit of oil that she has, and then she and her children will live off of the rest. So we explained that the Isha Achas, this one woman, is a reference to the soul. The neshama is a widow and complains, comes to God, Elisha's God, and says that my love and fear that I have for you are gone. I no longer have them. And the creditor, the noisha, which means creditor, also the word noisha we said is related to the word nashani, which we know that Yosef named his son Menashe, ki nashani elekim, nashani meaning that he made me forget, he caused me to forget. So the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination or the animal soul, attempts to have us forget God and our connection to God. But not only does he try to get us to forget God, he also wants to come claim our children. He wants to take my children as slaves. My children are my love and fear of Hashem, which are called children because our emotions, the emotions of our godly soul, are born from our intellect, so they're referred to as children. And he wants to take our love and fear of God and channel it into love and awe of and passion into unholy things. So God says to the soul, go collect empty vessels and fill them up with the little bit of oil you have. The little oil that the godly soul says I have left, that represents the essence of the soul. So if you pour from the essence of the soul into these empty vessels, then you will be able to live, you and your children will be able to live off of the interest, off of the surplus, off of the noisar. So we said, what does it mean to fill up empty vessels with the essence of the soul? So we gave two interpretations, two discourses, two mamarim of the Alter Rebbe, with two different interpretations of what the empty vessels are. One interpretation is the empty vessels means study Torah and perform mitzvahs in an empty fashion, meaning without love and fear, without the passion, without the emotion. And as we quoted from Tanya, or the Alter Rebbe quotes, that mitzvah b'lei kavana keguf b'lei neshama, that when you do a mitzvah without intent, without being motivated by love and fear of God, so it's like a body without a soul. So the empty vessel, meaning mitzvahs or Torah study, that is lacking passion, lacking enthusiasm, lacking that motivation that for God, that is, those are empty vessels. Consider an empty vessel. So study Torah and do mitzvahs anyway, even though you're not motivated, even though you lack the love and fear, but do it anyway, even if it's a hollow act. How is it that you can do it anyway? Because you're pouring from the jar of oil that you have, from the essence of the soul. Because as we explained, what prompts somebody who's not feeling any kind of connection to God to perform a mitzvah or to study Torah? Usually your performance of mitzvahs or your study of Torah is motivated, at least to some extent, by a desire to connect with God. So there's some kind of a love and a fear, or awe. I use the word fear, we mean really awe of God. There's that emotion or that feeling that motivates you to serve. What happens when you don't have any of that? How do you go ahead and serve? Because you recall the fact that even all of that, putting all that aside, if somebody were to force you or compel you to denounce God or give up your life, you're willing to die al kiddush Hashem. You're willing to sacrifice your very life for God. So since you would be willing to die for God, so in a case where you have an opportunity to study Torah or do mitzvahs, and it's not life or death, if you can recall the idea that you're ready to give up your life, which stems from the essence of the soul, if you can convince yourself that this is also a matter of life and death to an extent, that could compels you to perform the mitzvah or to study the Torah. So we see that the pouring of the essence of the soul into the empty vessels, that means that when you're lacking any kind of motivation, if you recall the essence of your soul, the fact that you never can be disconnected, you can never consciously disconnect from God, that can compel you to go ahead and perform the mitzvahs or study Torah in a way of empty vessels. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation we said is that the empty vessels means that you should think that you're an empty vessel. Recognize how far you've fallen, recognize how distant you are from God. And when you come to recognize that you're an empty vessel, you lack any kind of sensitivity to godliness, any feeling of closeness, any a passion and insight and connection, when you recognize that, you become saddened by your spiritual state that you're in, and that awakens the essence of the soul.
In that way around, it makes you more depressed.
So you have to do it in the right way. Yeah, if you're doing it in a way that's motivated by your animal soul, then it makes you depressed, and then that makes you fall even further. I don't want to get here. We're just talking about this idea of that to think, reflect on the fact you're an empty vessel. The truth is that this whole process of recognizing your lowliness and your distance from God is a very dangerous road and path to go down. So I don't want to get into that aspect of it now. Let's just talk about what we said in the Maimer. Yeah.
So the Isha is the soul, and then the Shemen is the essence of the soul?
Of the soul, yes. The Isha says, all I have left is the Asuch Shemen, just one small jar of oil. That's all the soul says I have left. That's all the Isha says she has left. So that is the only thing that's left in the tank, which is the essence that can never be extinguished. Okay, so then we said, so once you do that, you have these two ways of the soul, these two things. One is either perform Torah and mitzvahs in a hollow fashion, in an empty fashion, or to think and reflect on your lowliness and your distance from God. What comes as a result of that? Comes as a result of it is Atav Anayich Tichi B'Neiser. You and your children will live off of the Neiser, off of the extra, off of the surplus. What does that mean? So we explained from the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, that means the Yisra in Ha'or Min HaCheshach, that there's an advantage of the light that comes from the darkness. And so in the last class we discussed what this means. The light that comes from the darkness, it's two different lights coming from two different types of darkness, depending on which interpretation we have. The first interpretation, that we're talking about Torah mitzvahs, that you should perform it even though you're in a dark state. What does it mean, the light that comes from darkness? It means that in a place of darkness, your spiritual state, you're shining light, you're performing mitzvahs, you're learning Torah, that's light, that's godliness, whether it's an empty vessel or not, whether it's motivated by a love and fear or not, it's still a mitzvah, it's still Torah study. So you're shining a light, and what's the meaning of that light? There's a greater light that comes from darkness, is in order to illuminate a dark space, you need to have a greater light. So the light of the Torah and mitzvahs that are when you're in a state of feeling of darkness, when you're in a state of not having love and fear, that Ava and Yira, that's a greater light. That's a greater light that can illuminate darkness. But when we talk about the light that comes from the darkness, when a person reflects on how low they are, so what's the light that you get to? When you recognize that you're so low, you're so distant from God, feel so disconnected, and suddenly you're disgusted by that you feel like you should be in a better place, and you're not, so you get bitter in a way that's motivating, not depressing, which is debilitating, but it motivates you, it spurs you on. So what's the motivation coming from? What's fueling the motivation? The distance. The distance is fueling the motivation. So here we see that it's not that there's a light that's shining into the darkness, it's the darkness itself that is leading you to reconnect. It's leading you to improve. It's leading you to come closer. So here, there's the meaning of the light from the darkness means the darkness itself becomes light. You follow?
It's like negative fuel.
Okay. Yeah, but it's coming from that negative space, but that's causing you to get closer. So it's the darkness itself. So that's a higher level, because there's light, and then there's darkness that's beyond light.
It's like the bittul, where the sadness that you get from realizing how disconnected you are makes you...
Exactly. That's what's motivating. So here, the Yisrael Min HaCheshach means that the darkness itself is brighter, is the light. And when we call it darkness, and like we said, we quoted from Tehillim, Yashas Cheshach Sisrei, that Hashem conceals himself in darkness. What does it mean he conceals himself in darkness? So there's darkness, which means unholiness. That's a negative place. But what does it mean that God conceals himself in darkness? It means that there's a part of God that's so high it can't be revealed in a form of light. It's concealed in darkness. That darkness is even higher than light.
Why would someone do that?
It's too high it's too great to come down in a form of light. No. There's a revelation of godliness that can't be revealed in your conventional way. It's just dark. It's concealment. You can't. But we call it darkness because it's removed from us, because you can't see it in a revealed manner. So that's an even higher level. So the second form of Kelim Reikim Al Tamiti, of the empty vessels, of reflecting on how low you are, that actually reaches an even higher level of light. And then at the end of the first paragraph of chapter 3, we connected this with Tchias HaMesim. That the Chazal say that Ata v'nayich tichi b'noiser ad sheyichyu HaMesim. That this idea of living living on the extra, on the interest, that connects to Tchias HaMesim, because Tchias HaMesim, as it says in Kabbalah, is the Tala, the Natif Ma'atika, comes from the dew that stems from Atik. And in chapter 3, we discussed this idea a little bit more at length. The idea that there's two levels of transcendence, of makif. There's a makif hakariv and a makif harachik. And this relates to two levels of keser, which are higher than the created, than the 10 attributes that we're familiar with, that fashion, that form the structure of creation and existence, and that is the two levels of keser, atik and arich. What are makif hakariv and makif harachik that relate to atik and arich? So makif hakariv means a close, something that's transcendent, but it's close. So we said, for instance, a garment, levushim, clothing, are transcendent, meaning they go around the person, they don't enter the person. You eat food, that's how you survive. Food is a pnimi, it's internalized, and it's something your body can break down and process, and you live as a result of it. That's something that's internalized. Clothing come from an even higher level of in its source, and therefore they don't enter the person, they surround the person, and they offer protection and whatever way they enhance your life, but that is in a way of transcendent. It surrounds the person. But a lavush, a garment, is something that's still closely related to the individual, because you need something that fits. You need clothing that fit. You need clothing that bring out whatever your personal style, and so on. So the clothing are tailored to the individual. But then you have a house. A house also surrounds the person, but there it's not sized to fit. That's something that's more distant. So within the transcendent levels, you have transcendence as it's related to something becoming more internalized, and you have the level of transcendence that is totally beyond, totally removed from it. So when we say when we said that the second idea of Yisr Norman HaChoshech, the advantage that comes as a result of thinking of your lowliness, that's connected to the makif harachik, to the distant makif. And that's something that comes, you mentioned about bittul. We quoted where it says, L'she'eris nachalasai, the Gemara says that the pasuk that talks about the attributes of mercy, that God shines His attributes of mercy on an individual. So who does it say? The pasuk says, L'she'eris nachalasai, to the remnant of His inheritance, the remnant of His people. What does that mean? So the Gemara says, L'she'eris nachalasai l'misha meisim atzmei k'shirayim, somebody who makes himself like shirayim, like leftovers, like extra. Meaning somebody who has humility, somebody who considers himself insignificant, like leftovers. That's somebody who then can evoke and arouse within God the 13 attributes of mercy. So on one hand, you have the person being batal, totally nullified, totally considering himself as nothing, and that elicits the reverse, the 13 attributes, which are a transcendent level of godliness, that then come down as well. Well, we're talking about real humility, not talking about fake humility. Okay, so let's continue now. The second paragraph in chapter 3. Does everything make sense so far? It's adding up? Okay. This idea we explained before about these two levels of makif. There's the makif hakariv, there's the makif harachik, and that the makif harachik, the distant one, comes as a result of humility, of being humble, of making yourself l'she'eris nachlasi, making yourself like shirayim, like totally insignificant. So this is then the advantage of the second interpretation of Tichi B'Noiser, which comes from the merirus, from the bitterness that one has from thinking about how he's a kli reik in an empty vessel. Pirush Hasheni b'Kelim Reik Matamiti, the second interpretation of Kelim Reik Matamiti, which we brought from the Alter Rebbe. Ala Inyan de Tichi B'Noiser Shabal Yidei Sha'isik B'Teiro Mitzvahs Hagam She'en Lei Avavira. So we can now better understand the advantage of the second interpretation of Kelim Reik Matamiti, of gathering the empty vessels, which is that a person recognizes that he's a kli reik and he's an empty vessel, over the first interpretation, which is that he should perform Torah mitzvahs without the love and fear. When the advantage of studying Torah and performing mitzvahs, when you don't have love and fear, because remember we said, obviously a person should perform mitzvahs, should study Torah, with a great love and fear of God. That's the proper way to do it. But we said that there's an advantage when you're lacking it. If you're lacking that love and fear, and you study Torah and do mitzvahs anyway, so there you reach. Remember, we said Tichi Benoiser. You're going to be able to get to a greater light. Well, how do you get to that greater light? It's because what motivates you then? If you're lacking motivation, so how do you overcome those impulses and the instincts of your animal soul to nevertheless continue persevering and studying Torah and performing mitzvahs? It's through arousing the koyach hamesiris nefesh, the capacity that we have for self-sacrifice. The inyan hamesiris nefesh umitzad etzem hanusham shel ma'alim kechos agluim avira. And self-sacrifice is something that is more deeply rooted in the soul than love and fear of God. Love and fear of God are something that are related with your consciousness, with the part of you that understands, that comprehends, that can appreciate. But self-sacrifice comes from the essence of the soul. That's beyond understanding. It's beyond reason. So you as a rational person, you have a love and a fear of God. But your self-sacrifice, that's an irrational act. So you can, when you arouse that level of that potential for self-sacrifice, you're reaching an even higher level. Nevertheless, even though what's motivating, you're serving God, you're studying Torah and doing mitzvahs, when you don't have that love and fear, even though it's being motivated by yourself, by your capacity for self-sacrifice, which, as we said, is beyond your own conscious self, it's beyond your internal understanding and appreciation of godliness. Nevertheless, you're not totally nullified. There's not a total bittul that's taking place here. Why? Because the fact that you're doing this is a choice. You're choosing to do this. Let's take a look at note 31. The Rebbe addresses a question here. We're saying Mesiris Nefesh, self-sacrifice, is something generally in Chassidus that is described. The idea that the novelty of self-sacrifice is that a person can't choose self-sacrifice. It's not something you choose. It's not a choice you make. It's something you're incapable of choosing opposite. So the example of the ultimate form and expression of self-sacrifice, which, by the way, if you see it even by one person, in a sense, that proves the rule. But not everybody actually can express it. Even all those that died throughout our very long history on Al Kiddush Hashem, not all of their sacrifice necessarily expressed this idea. Although since we know it to be the case, to be so therefore you can apply it. What is that? What is it? That a person who doesn't feel necessarily connected to God, doesn't feel committed to God, doesn't live their life in accordance with what God desires, and yet when they're faced with a challenge, and they recognize deeply that this is a moment of truth where either I connect to God or disconnect from God, they're incapable of choosing to disconnect. They're incapable. And so they have self-sacrifice, not because they're trying to make a statement, and not because they're being defiant, and not because they're trying to prove a point. They're just not capable of going against God. So that's not a choice that's made. The whole novelty of Mesiris Nefesh, the way Chassidus explains it, is that there is no choice. That it's as if you're compelled to do it because you can't go against your very essence, your very core. You can't deny your own essence. So it's not that you choose one way or the other. You're incapable of choosing against it. So that expresses the essential bond that the person has with God.
So it's not necessarily a positive thing that the person did. It's
right. They're not capable of choosing otherwise. But on the other hand, it reveals how deeply that person's connected with God. You see how connected the person is with God.
We're not using the term properly when we say this person is Meiser Nefesh.
Right. So you could choose to have Mesiris Nefesh, for sure. Goyim could also choose Mesiris Nefesh. They do, all the time. What? So right. So the point is, the novelty of Mesiris Nefesh is that it's not a choice. It's not a choice. So if that's the case... it's not a choice. So if that's the case, if it's not a choice, so why are you telling me here that the idea of Torah mitzvahs that we accomplish by arousing that power of Mesiris Nefesh, so we're saying it's still connected to me. The whole point of Mesiris Nefesh is not connected to my own frame of mind, to my own lifestyle, to my own choice. It's something that's beyond all of that. So if I'm triggering that Mesiris Nefesh, or I'm accessing it to then perform Torah mitzvahs, so what's greater than that? How is that connected with my mitzias, with my existence? So the Rebbe, let's see what he says in note 31. Agam de teva Mesiris Nefesh b'kol echad ve'echad miYisrael hu lo mitzad haratzon shelo yelu mipnei she'einu yachol liparad chas v'shalom achdusei yisbarech. And even though the power of Mesiris Nefesh that's found within each and every one of us is because he's not capable of disconnecting himself from God's oneness. Hinezehu kishabal Mesiris Nefesh b'poil. This is true, and this is accessed and experienced when a person actually gives his life. Which then that is an expression of his essence, the Yechida, the highest level of the soul. But so long as a person is not actually sacrificing his life, he's merely recalling this capacity that he has to give his life for God, which then allows him to overpower his evil inclination. What prompts a person? In Tanya, we quoted this, I think, in the first class. This idea that Rebbe discusses in Tanya, a great tool to be able to overcome your evil inclination. You have a Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara doesn't want you to serve God, and you are not particularly motivated to serve God. So how do you overcome it? How do you overcome it? So the Rebbe says, remember the fact that you would be willing to give your life for God. Not just willing, but you. Here we're saying it's not just that you're willing to give your life; you're incapable of not giving your life for God. So were it a situation of life and death, you would choose death. So if that's the case, to do this mitzvah, it's not life and death. How much more so shouldn't you do it? So you're kind of tricking yourself into, right? It's a form of like trickery. You're tricking yourself into making this a life or death situation, where now I can overwhelm my Yetzer Hara, my evil inclination. But why do you do that? It's not a life or death situation. At least it's not a situation. See, Alter Rebbe says in a way it is. Every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect, and every sin is a form of disconnection from God. So in a sense, it is a bit of a life and death situation, but it's not to the same extent as a test of Mesiris Nefesh. So what prompts you to then recall this idea? In other words, you have to go through this whole reasoning process, right? You're making a kal v'chomer in your mind, right? If I'm willing to give my life, so shouldn't I be willing to do this mitzvah? I don't have to give my life. What prompts you to go through this whole thought process? You choose to. I really want to serve God, but I can't muster up the strength and the motivation for it. So therefore I make this whole calculation, and that gets me going. That snaps me into action. Ultimately, you want to overcome your Yetzer Hara. Ultimately, you want to serve God, or you want to get to a place where you're actually serving God. So it's still a choice that you're making. So when a person gives their life, that's not a choice. The whole point of Mesiris Nefesh is that it's not a choice that you make. It's not something you go through in your mind. You play out the scenarios. Should I do it this way? Should I do that way? And I choose this way or the other way. You're incapable of choice. But here, even though you're accessing this as this concept of Mesiris Nefesh, but you're choosing to do it. And since you're choosing to do it, on some level, to some extent, even performing Torah mitzvahs, when you're not motivated, by recalling the Mesiris Nefesh, by accessing that jar of oil that still remains, the essence of the soul, it's still connected with your Metzias. It's still connected with you. So therefore, Agilid Etzem HaNeshama Shebazeh, Hu Rak K'meish Sheyeches L'Koiches HaGluim, Ad Agdei Shezeh Chirim Mesiris Nafsh Shel Hashem, Shemitzad Etzem HaNeshama, Ratzin Shlei B'Torah Mitzvahs U'B'Teikev Gadol. So ultimately, it's still connected with your existence, and therefore, even though you're remembering the fact of the idea of self-sacrifice, still it's connected with your koiches hagluim. So if we go back to what we said in the beginning of chapter 3 about these two levels of makif, there's the distant makif and there's the close makif. The close makif. So remember, we talked about also what the idea of distant makif, close makif, atik and arich, two levels in keser. We discussed, if you remember, on Monday, that in Kabbalah talks about Keser, the level of Keser in the divine Godhead or structure. So in some places it says Keser is connected to the 10 attributes that follow, to Chachma, Bina, Das, etc. And in another place it says that it's not connected. So he said the Arizal explained and sort of brought the two together, combined it and said like this. There's a level of Keser that is connected to the 10 attributes that follow. There's the level of Keser that's higher than creation. As it were, and by creation, we don't just mean, heaven and earth. We mean all of the creative process from Chachma and on. And then there's a level of Keser that's beyond it. There's a level that's removed. So there's a part of Keser, which is Arich, that becomes a source for something else. So a source is higher than the thing that comes from it, but it's still a source for it. And then there's a level that's beyond even being a source. So this idea of arousing the Koyach HaMesiris Nefesh, even though you're talking about essence, but you're talking about essence that's connected to what follows. Why? Because it's a choice that you're making. So it's still connected with your own existence. And so therefore, since you're choosing to perform Torah and mitzvahs by recalling the Mesiras Nefesh, since it's a choice you're making, so therefore what's the light that you elicit, that you draw as a result of it? The Yisr Na'or Min HaChoshech, the light we said, the light that comes into darkness. It's a great light, it's the Oir of Makif, it's a transcendent level of light, but it's still the light that comes from Arich, it's still a level that's connected to creation, to existence. But the advantage that comes from the feeling that a person has, from the bitterness of feeling that he's an empty vessel, since through this a person completely loses his existence. So you're listening an even higher light, one that's not yet all connected to the Kaychas Agluim, to all of creation and existence, and to the person's own existence. So is to with what we're drawing Momaila from above. Shum Maila. So therefore, since a person feeling like a Kli Reker, an empty vessel, loses his own feeling, his sense of self, he's completely nullified. As what does he draw as a result? The light that's totally removed from it. So here we've kind of closed the chapter on this Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, on the two discourses of the Alter Rebbe, the two interpretations, and we've given a deeper insight into the difference between the two interpretations of Kelim Reikim, whether it's performing Torah mitzvahs or whether it's the idea of bittul, being totally nullified from a person's spiritual state. And we explained that each one elicits a different level of godliness. Each one elicits one level, one that's connected to the individual, because even though we're talking about a transcendent level, but still it's transcendence as it's related to the person's existence, so that's a lower level. That's the light, let's say, that comes from Arich. And then you have Atik, you have the higher level of transcendent light, the one that we call darkness, where it's called darkness itself, because it's totally removed from light, it's totally removed from the order and structure of creation, and that comes as a result of the higher, of the second interpretation of Kelim Reikim, the feeling that a person is totally nullified because of their distance from God. Okay, so what time is it? 9:02. Okay, so we can continue. Any questions before we continue with chapter 4? No, we're okay. Okay, it's an easy crowd. Okay, chapter 4. It's a hard mimer and an easy crowd, so it's a good combination. Chapter 4. So now we have a question. Oh, actually, before we get to chapter 4, let's look at note 32. And we're going to get into tshuva. We'll explore tshuva later in chapter 4, but let's take a look at 32. We find the same thing, these two levels, the higher transcendent level, the lower transcendent level, we find these two with regard to tshuva as well. Aleph, first one is the first level is that a Baal Tshuva, we know that a Baal Tshuva reaches a higher level than a tzaddik. Why? So we have different ways of understanding it. One is, the Baal Tshuva has a much greater thirst and desire for God than the tzaddik, because the tzaddik's love of God and yearning for God is a pleasant one, is a calm one, because they're always connected, always feel close. The Baal Tshuva, who comes from being distant from God, has a more intense love and a more intense yearning. You always find the Baal Tshuva is always somebody who's a much more intense feeling about their Judaism. It's a much more passionate feeling. Beis, shenasa nivza be'einav nimos chulumoyis b'chayav. The other thing in tshuva is that a person, so one is that the tshuva spurs an intense love and yearning for God. But the other one is that the tshuva causes a person to be totally disgusted with themselves. And through that the person can draw, the Baal Tshuva can draw chesed of Atik. Atik again is the higher level of transcendent light that we're referring to. And the Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah connects the second level, not the first. The Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah brings these ideas of there's the second concept where the Alter Rebbe explains the second idea of tshuva, that the Baal Tshuva becomes disgusted with himself, with his own status, his own place in relation to God. in a Maimer where the Alter Rebbe explains this idea of tshuva, he then connects it with shirayim, which we're talking about here. The idea of shirayim, that a person feels insignificant, and that insignificance is what then draws the chesed of atik, similar to what we're talking about here. Okay.
To discuss an issue a person did it to himself.
I'm sorry?
It's an issue someone did it to himself. Say someone did a mistake, he should be discussing himself. Not someone who's born in a nonsense house. Why should he have that feeling?
Fine.
You should feel disgusted. Someone made a mistake on life.